A major consequence of these cultural differences is that whenever cultural differences in education, more precisely educational achievement, are measured across the world, we always see the same picture. The East Asian nations always score on top. It's always one of the Chinese-speaking countries, either Singapore or now China or Taiwan or Hong Kong. Japan also scores very high. Vietnam also does very well. And then it's usually Russia scoring next, and some North European countries. Whereas Latin America and Africa and the Arab world and unfortunately the Balkan countries where I am, they're at this extreme. They score almost like Latin American countries on this dimension. Unfortunately, we're not so good in education, which can be explained as an outcome of these different cultural attitudes. On the other hand, we must remember that nothing is only good or bad. This axis, the East-West axis, is also the axis of happiness, not life satisfaction, which I discussed previously, but happiness measured as joy and good mood. Good mood is most prevalent in Latin America and Africa, and least frequent in East Asia. And one of the explanations is that when people have low self-esteem, when they live with this feeling that they're not very good and they must constantly strive to improve this imperfect self, they must study very long hours. Children in East Asia study a lot instead of playing. The outcome of this is a human self that is not very happy. And another unfortunate outcome is depression and relatively high suicide rates versus good mood in Latin America and Africa. Vice versa, another outcome of these differences in culture and education is that unfortunately Latin America and Africa have the highest violent crime rates in the world, measured in terms of homicide, killings per 100,000 people, and assault and robbery. Whereas the East Asian countries and Northern Europe and South Europe as well are the safest countries in the world in this respect. This is a complex issue, but it has to do with this dimension, and it has to do with differences in education. One of the explanations is that when people are not well educated, they cannot find jobs, and when the environment is poor and they don't have opportunities, they turn to crime. It's much more complicated than this, of course, but this is just a simplification. Another important implication of this cultural map is gender relations and the position of women in society. All over the world, even in the Scandinavian countries, women complain that they're not equal to men, that they don't have the same opportunity, that there is sexism in societies. But when this is measured objectively in terms of percentage of women in parliament and the rights that women have and the abuses that they suffer in reality, we see that gender egalitarianism is greatest in the North European countries and lowest in Africa and the Middle East. Although some Asian countries, Japan, in this particular respect, resemble the countries in Africa and the Arab world. It is well known that in Japan, women have never held high-ranking managerial positions. They don't participate in government as political leaders. So Japan is quite conservative in this respect. There are many other cultural differences that can be explained in terms of this map, but I hope that by now you realize the implications and the significance of studying culture and cultural differences across the world. Cultural differences exist at the level of whole societies, but they exist inside families, inside schools, inside companies. And to understand all of these, we need to look at families and schools and organizations and what people do in the streets and how they drive and to what extent they follow the laws and norms of their countries. It's very complex, but at the end of the day, we can understand cultural differences, and if we are smart enough, we can find ways to live together and cooperate and improve our cross-cultural understanding, and finally, ultimately, live in a better world. Thank you very much.